This is a situation, a Ponzi scheme, which is about to fail. And the first element of it which will fail, quite simply, is the euro, the Eurozone. So we're talking about one of the largest economic blocs in the world, similar in size to that of the United States. And I find it very hard to imagine a situation where the Eurozone and the euro fails without very significant knock-on consequences for all the other currencies. The other way in which this goes wrong is when we see interest rates rising because energy prices are rising and rising and rising, and we will see the effect on the Eurozone. And I think that is something that you've got to monitor very, very carefully, because that, to my mind, is the weak point in the Western financial system. That is the one that will fail first. That is the one to watch.
Here at Liberty in Finance, we're licensed brokers with Miles Franklin. We are standing by ready to make sure you get what you need, even into the wee hours of night and on weekends, because preparedness doesn't stop. Call us 1-888-81-LIBERTY.
Welcome back to Liberty in Finance. Our guest is a well-recognized one, Alasdair Macleod, a former bank director and contributor at Macleod Finance, and also head of research at goldmoney.com, is with us again this Thursday, March 3rd, 2022. Alasdair, thanks for coming back on.
That's my pleasure, DK.
There's so many things going on right now in our geopolitical and financial lives that it's hard to know where to begin. To people pointing out the fires that are burning everywhere. And it often is interesting to people when they say, hey, why aren't you still a preparedness site like you once were when it was called Reluctant Preppers? And it emerged that financial risks are looming and present. It's like we're on the train tracks and the train is heading straight towards us, and it's been blowing its horn for some time. So it's one of those combined missions of helping people be aware and prepared is almost inescapable to talk about economic and financial concerns right now. In fact, you just wrote an article today about that people can find. We'll put a link to it in the description of this video, called When Normality is Exposed as a Ponzi, and you had the provocative conclusion that you discussed with me that the world war that we seem to be in is turning into an economic one or financial one. Can you clarify what you mean by that and why people need to be aware and pay attention?
Yes, sure. We've been in a financial conflict between the West, America, UK, Europe on one side, and Russia and China on the other. And it's really sort of broken out quite seriously into the public arena with the Russian central bank being denied access to most of its reserves, its dollar and euro reserves in particular, and a little bit of sterling. And really what that means is that the reserves held at the Russian central bank are worthless. So as far as and also ordinary Russians can't use foreign currency either. So you have this situation where paper currency is now completely worthless. And the problem that creates is that as far as Russia is concerned, they now see gold as being the only money which really counts. And there's a misunderstanding about the Russian economy too. In the West, we think it's fundamentally weak. We think it's a kleptocracy and all the rest of it. But actually, if you just look at a few key metrics, like government debt to GDP is 20%. I mean, in America, it's 133%. If you look at the income tax rate, income tax is a flat rate at 13%. I mean, and there's very light regulation of businesses as well. These are conditions which any libertarian would, think, oh, this is wonderful. I wish we had that. But instead, we have a situation where virtually all Western governments now, of any consequence anyway, are responsible for more than 50% of their GDP. In other words, the productive private sector is has become a minor part of everything. So where is the weakness? Is it in Russia or here? The answer quite clearly is it is here. And we're embarking on this financial war And the most vulnerable currency in all this, of course, is the euro. I think we've spoken about the euro before. I certainly wrote about it, I think, 3 weeks ago, because I looked at the balance sheet of all the central banks in the euro system, and the only ones which had assets in excess of liabilities were the Irish Central Bank, the Maltese Central Bank, and the Slovenian Central Bank. All the rest have liabilities which exceed their assets. The reason this has come about is because they now have substantial portfolios of bonds through quantitative easing, through asset purchase programs, and all the rest of it. The problem with that is that that's all very well, unless if bond prices don't fall. But the moment they start falling, losses start appearing on these central bank balance sheets. You've got exactly the same thing in the Fed. It doesn't appear on the Fed's balance sheet because everything is carried at final redemption value. You don't have it in the Bank of England because in the Bank of England, it's in a special purpose vehicle, which is off balance sheet. And there is an asset shown on the balance sheet, which is a loan to this special purpose vehicle. The whole thing being guaranteed by the UK Treasury. So as bond prices fall, the Bank of England can be bailed out, which would be extremely embarrassing, obviously. And the Fed, I mean, it just holds things to maturity, so it would probably ignore it. But the ECB has a problem because the ECB itself is, it doesn't have a government to turn to. Its shareholders are the other national central banks, and they're all underwater. So you've got a system which is inherently bust. And the only reason that the euro continues is because people don't think it's bust. They're not aware it's bust. We now have a major disruption with financial sanctions against Russia. And of course, quite a number of Eurozone banks have substantial interests in the Russian economy. So these banks basically, I mean, if you look at something like, a major French bank has been told that it's 14 billion euros worth of loans into the Russian economy are now worthless, gone. So now that's a very nasty hit. Maybe not enough to take down a particular bank, but this is certainly the case. I think with UniCredit. UniCredit has got about 14 billion euros outstanding. If you look at one of the French banks has also this situation, and these banks, some of these banks are very, very highly leveraged. I mean, we're talking about up to 20 to 30 times leverage. Assets, the ratio between assets and equities. So, this is a serious situation. And guess what? The Russians are beginning to squeeze on the oil a bit. One of the pipelines, they've cut out one of the pipelines supplying gas through Ukraine. And that, I think, has reduced sort of, if you like, gas exports into Europe by a figure like 20% or something like that. So they're beginning to tighten the screw. And we've got the situation where, how does Europe pay for this gas? It's all very well for the politicians to turn around and say, in effect, we're going to put sanctions on you, Russia, Mr. Putin, which are going to be so hard that you're not going to survive. But meanwhile, we will pay for the oil and gas which we expect you to sell us. What? His break even on oil, incidentally, is about $45. When I look at the price of oil here at the moment is 110. So, it can halve, and he's still in profit. I mean, say him in profit. That's not going to happen. I mean, he's putting the screws on, and you find that oil and gas will continue to rise. And it's a rise, incidentally, which is fueled by all the currency printing that we've had from all the major central banks over the last, particularly over the last 2 years, but cumulatively, really, from ever since the Lehman crisis. So this is the situation which I think is now leading to the problems which we've talked about before, with the fragility, if you like, of the currency, the whole fiat currency situation. And in that article, I described it as a Ponzi scheme, and basically it is, because what the central banks are doing is they're saying, we will print money to make you wealthy. Your shares will go up, your bonds won't go down, your house prices will go up because the banks will let them print more credit in the form of mortgages. So inflation is good for you. No, it isn't, because you're not looking at the other side of the Ponzi scheme. The Ponzi scheme is that we're paying for it. So some people are doing very well out of it, but the majority of us aren't. Those of us without assets, those of us who don't own the house over our roof over our head, those of us living on savings, the elderly and so on. The people who can't negotiate higher wages because they're at the bottom of the skill chain and so on and so forth. So this is a situation, a Ponzi scheme, which is about to fail. And the first element of it which will fail, quite simply, is the euro, the Eurozone. So we're talking about one of the largest economic blocs in the world, similar in size to that of the United States. And I find it very hard to imagine a situation where the Eurozone and the euro fails without very significant knock-on consequences for all the other currencies. I mean, apart from anything else, think of all the bad debts that are going to start accumulating, and the non-pay, the incompleted payments. One of the things which everybody's been going on about is we cut Russia off through SWIFT. They won't be able to use SWIFT. All SWIFT is a messaging service. I've used it as a banker. It's a form that you fill out, and you can do different sort of SWIFT messages. But I could send you money easily. I could send you $1 million basically by we agree the terms over emails, and then I send you an email and say, right, DK, there's $1 million in your account. And you log into your bank account, and sure enough, there will be $1 million there. We don't need SWIFT. SWIFT is not really necessary in that sense. The problem is the regulators. The regulators will jump down on any bank which has not done its due diligence in terms of source of funds and on transactions. Is there a Russian interest? So that, the compliance departments and in-house lawyers are going to be crawling over virtually every transaction where there is just a suspicion that there might be a Russian interest involved. And what this also means is that, okay, we've turned around and said we'll give a free pass on any payments for oil and gas and all the rest of it. But the problem is that in a bank, you've got a compliance officer, and they're not really known for very much imagination. They're really very risk-averse people. And, if in doubt, they will chuck it out. And so you'll get a lot of payments which just won't happen. No, I could go on and on and on. I've got more detail about the problems that the euro faces, which are likely to be triggered by the blowback from the sanctions we've imposed on Russia. And Russia is actually, Putin has made a big mistake going into Ukraine. Let's be absolutely clear on that. But the effect of that, as he struggles with Ukraine, is he's going to up the ante, not with nuclear weapons. That was a threat, basically, I think, to get people to start talking. And so you had this meeting on the Belarusian border, went absolutely nowhere. That's probably what that was about. But we have a situation now where Putin is getting desperate, which basically means that we have misread his economy. We have misread the ability of his central banker in the form of Elvira Ljubljana, who is a very switched on, a good economist and good central banker. She, since 2014, she was appointed in 2013. Since 2014, she has gone through the West's attempt to destabilize the Russian economy and the ruble. And at that time, the oil price fell by 70%, from over $100 down to $30 by sort of end of 2016. I think it was about 21 months. She steered the economy through that. You have a banking system now which is probably the most sound in Europe. Obviously there's a history of volatility with the ruble, and there is no doubt that there are runs on banks with people going to ATMs trying to take money out as and when they can. But this is not a serious problem. Central banks are used to handling these periodic crises. And this lady is a lot smarter than the average central banker. I don't see that's a huge problem. But what I do see as a problem is the fact that the West has effectively turned around to the Russian central bank, and therefore the Russian nation and Putin, and said, the reserves that you have in the form of currency are now worthless. What are you going to do? Well, if they're worthless, then I think the answer is that probably what Putin will do is he will probably sell oil and gas for settlement in Chinese yuan, which would be done via the Chinese banking system. Fine. The other thing he'll do is he'll say, well, we would prefer to be settled in gold. Now, that's an interesting point. Also, there was an announcement that the central bank is increasing, it's going back into buying domestically mined gold and so on and so forth. And if you look at the level of gold reserves relative to narrow money supply, I think we're talking about $140 billion worth of gold at the central bank. This is officially recognized. There's probably more actually unofficially recognized, but we won't speculate on that. And narrow money supply is in the region of about $115 billion equivalent. So you can see that narrow money or narrow currency is covered by gold already. And I think they're going to build on that. And so we have a situation which I never thought would happen. And that is that, yes, we are moving towards some sort of gold standard somewhere, but it is at our provocation. I thought it would be, say, China or Russia deciding that this is actually what they're going to do without us pushing them into it. It's us that are doing it. It's extraordinary, an extraordinary situation.
Yeah, that dynamic that you just mentioned reminds me of the quote, I believe it's attributed to Warren Buffett, saying, when the tide goes out, you get to find out who's been swimming naked. And it seems baffling, and I guess if you could just see if there's any further thoughts you want to add to that it's the U.S. and the Eurozone, and the Eurozone particularly, that are more vulnerable in a banking system standpoint or a currency standpoint than Russia. And so to put the squeeze on Russia could very well backfire and cause the toppling of the euro.
Yes, that's right. And it was Warren Buffett who that quote came from. I can't see how the Eurozone is going to survive this because of that problem that I described, that they've loaded themselves up with bonds. Interest rates are rising. Now, I know that the central banks are going to turn around and say that this squeeze in oil prices or energy prices is transient. Whoops, no, we better not use that word. Temporary. That's a better word. And once it all returns back to normal, what we're likely to see is that the initial effect will be to dampen down economic activity, which reduces the pressure for interest rates. We would be wise to wait for interest rates. We're already getting this in America. They're saying that the half-point increase, which was expected later this month, is now expected to be a 0.25% increase. So you've already got this narrative beginning to sort of roll. But it's absolute rubbish. And I can tell you that the Russians have Europe squeezed on energy. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised to see West Texas Intermediate, over 120, 130, 140, even, I don't know, I mean, where it'll end. But the parallel is not really what happened between 2014 and 2016 when we punished Russia for invading Crimea. I think the better comparison is the 1970s. I mean, we went into the 1970s with oil at under $3 a barrel. And we had Sheikh Yamani and all the rest of it organizing OPEC and, the price rising and all the rest of it. And towards the end of that decade, it was just a little bit under $30 a barrel. So I think that's the comparison. This is what's happening. these oil prices are being fueled by all the money printing or currency printing that's been going on globally, particularly at an accelerated rate over the last 2 years. And guess what? They'll print even more in order to pay for the higher prices. So this is a situation which, unfortunately, we've got ourselves into. And there's an old saying, if you live in a glass house, don't throw stones. That's more or less what we've been doing.
Well, you've been sharing with us for several years that the Russian central bank was accumulating more physical gold than the West, and that's been interesting because people have heard that about China as well. You've talked to us about that as well. So it seems that Russia and China have been strengthening the the physical foundation of their currency, whereas the Western countries have not. And so it does seem counterproductive and potentially volatile and potentially quite hazardous for the West then to say we're going to use these financial methods to put the squeeze on and use them as a financial weapon when they're the ones who could fall the farthest. There's a related question to something you just talked about from Uday Pai, who says, despite all these currency problems, why are we not seeing a single country coming forward to announce that it wants to back its currency with gold or silver?
The reason for that is quite simple, and that is that part of the dollar hegemony is to completely exclude gold. I mean, this goes as far as if you would have ambitions for your currency to be in the SDR, you cannot back it with gold at all. It's an entirely paper thing, and this is written into effectively the constitution of the SDR. So I think central bankers are, on the one hand, their public management of their currencies is to deny any monetary role for gold, while at the same time they are quite keen to have something, if you like, in one of the sort of pockets, which is nobody else's liability, and that, of course, is gold. It's just, if you like, I think that the central bankers, they play along with this idea that, gold is no longer part of the global monetary system, but they like to have a bit of an insurance policy just in case. Some are more, if you like, sort of stronger on the insurance side, like, for example, the Bundesbank. There is a core of sound money men in the Bundesbank, and they have been beaten down by the ECB. But Jens Wiedemann resigned, and I think left the Bundesbank for unspecified reasons. But I mean, he resigned. It wasn't, he didn't do anything wrong. He wasn't sacked, and this isn't a cover up for a sack. He actually resigned, and I think, Wiedemann's was a sound money man, and so he was finding himself, I think, rather like a square peg in a round hole. With the power of the ECB, he was effectively being told what to do, told to do things he didn't want to do, didn't think were right as a sound money man. And I think that's why he's resigned. I would just hope that when the euro falls over, and I think it's a matter of weeks, incidentally, this is not something which I think is going to take an awful long time. Probably a month or two at the outside. I just hope that Wiedemanns will come back and supervise the reintroduction of a sound Deutschmark, because we're going to need people like him. People who actually do understand that sound money is virtuous, if you like, in terms of an economy. I mean, he understands that, so I think that's a sort of a rather long-winded answer to your question. I think that we do have sound money people, if you like, who won't put their heads above the parapet in this current environment, and that is why no central bank at the moment accepts that gold should back their currency. And of course, the other thing is that the gold price is rising. Then that means that you're increasing the purchasing power of your currency if you tie it to gold, compared with the dollar. And with conventional, unsound Keynesian theory, to have a rising currency against other currencies is going to disadvantage competitiveness in international markets. So That's, I suppose, the best answer I can come up with.
Well, it takes me back to our roots as a preparedness channel when we used to be called reluctant preppers. The idea is if you don't have it in your hand, you don't own it. If you need to have tangibles, you need to have things that are real. And it seems that countries that do have real things, even you mentioned the economic power that Russia still wields by having oil and gas, things that are real. Rick Rule listed in the past week here a whole host of other very highly desired natural resources that Russia has that the West doesn't want to do without. And so in the spirit of which countries actually have the power, it does seem to reflect back on the ability for self-determination, that whether it's at an individual level, a household level, or at a sovereign nation level. If you don't have what you need, you're vulnerable, and if you have what you need, you have staying power. So I think you've been describing several aspects of that. In a war, an economic war, that seems to rise very prominently to the surface of who's going to be at a tactical disadvantage when there starts to be this siege, this suffocation siege of we won't do business with you anymore. We'll prevent you from doing business. Oh, but we desperately need what you have. Any more thoughts on that theme before we turn to some viewers' questions?
Yeah, I mean, I think primarily it's a matter for an internal economy rather than international relations. And that's where it all goes wrong, because one country tries to browbeat another one into conditions which it believes country A will benefit from if country B follows these policies. And I mean, that basically is something that's just built and built and built and built. I think that you're absolutely right. There is this element of self-sufficiency, but the people who decide it actually shouldn't be the state. It should be individuals. And when the state gets involved in these things, it all goes wrong. I mean, one of my favorite quotes from Milton Friedman, who's not an economist I would really recommend. I mean, there are elements of what he said which perhaps might be useful, but he said if you put the government in charge of the desert, it would run out of sand within 5 years. And that is so true. It really is. And so these are matters for individuals. And I think any individual who turns around and thinks the state owes me my living, it owes me my comfort, it owes me my food, it owes me my clothes, it owes me whatever, I think that's a reprehensible approach. It is unrealistic. And I think that when the whole system falls over, which is what we're talking about with the Ponzi scheme and currencies, then I'm afraid people who take that view are going to be in for a very nasty shock.
Many people are looking for where is the canary in the coal mine? What is going to falter first, where they say, oh yeah, look, that part of the system has now failed and that contagion could spread and could pull down other parts of the system. It certainly has happened in the past. Neil Hahn asks, why do other countries' high interest rates not affect America? So again, we've seen some runaway interest rates in certain jurisdictions around the world, but yet the Fed continues to hold rates at or near zero in the U.S. Can you talk to us about how this can happen and what you think will unfold in that arena?
Well, I mean, there are obviously two aspects to this. You've got the foreign aspect and you've got the domestic U.S. aspect. But if you look at the foreign aspect, then a country like Turkey, for example, there is a fundamental distrust in paper currency in Turkey. In this, we're talking about the domestic Turkish economy. People would far rather have gold. So what they do is they actually hold on to gold, but they spend the lira. And the distrust that the government faces about its own currency has been undermining the lira. I mean, they consolidated 1 million to 1. I think it was in 2002, 2003. And we're still looking at a lira which is going down the pan, measured against the dollar. And you can see that Erdogan's approach to monetary affairs is childish. I mean, it's the only way to describe it. So that's one side of it. That's why interest rates in Turkey are high, why interest rates in some other countries are high. And indeed, they've just had to double them in Russia. And it's really, I think, the sort of domestic perception about the stability of the currency, which is really the guiding factor there. When you look at the other side, we're looking at a dollar whereby interest rates are suppressed. I mean, we know, we've talked about this before, the level of real interest rates is ridiculously negative. I mean, we've got 7.5% CPI inflation, and yet the yield on the 10-year US Treasury is 1.7%, or 1.8%. This is, unsustainable. Sooner or later, the markets are going to turn around and say this is wrong and reprice it. And I'm not saying that this will be repriced by the Fed. It will be repriced by markets. What tends to happen is you have an event which means that the central bank loses control. The event can either be a domestic one, like the mismanagement of the government's finances gets to such a pitch that the currency starts being sold down in the foreign exchanges, and the only way in which the slide in the currency can be stopped is by raising interest rates. So there you've got an example of how the market starts taking over the pricing of things, and the central bank can only respond, and they tend to respond reluctantly and belatedly. That I think is the problem that we have really in major markets such as the US market, US financial markets, UK financial markets, Japanese financial markets, European financial markets. They are all rigged, and sooner or later that's going to come to an end. And as I say, it's going to be an event that does it. And I think that by turning what was a sort of under the surface financial war between the West and on the one side and Russia and China on the other, and really ramping that up, the blowback from that, I think, is going to be what destabilizes us. And so the moves that we've made, I can understand them from the political point of view, but they're very unwise, very, very unwise.
You've talked about this topic significantly here today, and I just wanted to give you one more chance if you want to give people a clue of things that they could watch for. William Mueller asks, how soon before China and Russia return to the option by China broadening the use of the digital yuan backed by gold, or Russia settling resource trades in gold in return for Russia being banned from the SWIFT? So are there specific signposts, that happened, that's what I was talking about, that you're watching for, where people will be able to say, yep, that's what Alasdair warned us about in that regards?
Well, let me deal with the digital currency story first. Digital currencies take some time to introduce. First of all, central banks can't really agree what they should use them for. And the other thing is that it cuts out the commercial banking network. So in the case of America, for example, you would have to have some legislation which would go through the Senate. The one business community that would really be cut out of all this are the commercial banks. And you've then got to ask, how would they react to this? And I think the answer quite simply is that any congressman, senator who would support a bill to introduce a digital currency would find that his funding, his electoral expenses and all the rest of it, which is all funded by the banking system, would be withdrawn. I just don't see it getting through the House. We're talking about a process which probably in America, at the quickest, even if it was to get through, would probably take 3 or 4 years. We don't have that time. This financial war, which I'm talking about, and the effect on the Eurozone, the Euro system, undermining the central banks in the system, it'll undermine the commercial banks as well, but I'm talking about the central banks being undermined and the euro itself losing all credibility. That is something that we can find will happen within a matter of weeks or maybe at the outside a few months. It is that immediate. So When it comes to looking at waypoints, one is we'll see whether Russia starts aggressively accumulating gold. We will see whether the markets begin to realize that gold is central to all this. And that indication, we would see gold go up over $2,000 and sort of, and some. Stories that Russia are in the market buying gold, that sort of thing. On top of that, there is a possibility that Russia might turn around and say, because all its paper currency from the West is worthless. It is worthless in Russia now. At the central bank's hands, it is completely worthless. They don't want any now. They won't want any. They'd be mad to have any. So they're going to turn around at some stage and say, well, we'll give you two options. You can either settle through Chinese yuan, or alternatively, you can settle in gold. We're very happy to take the gold off you. Now, at that point, I think we start to see things going horribly wrong. The other way in which this goes wrong is when we see interest rates rising because energy prices are rising and rising and rising, and we will see the effect on the Eurozone. And I think that is something that you've got to monitor very, very carefully, because that, to my mind, is the weak point in the Western financial system. That is the one that will fail first. That is the one to watch.
Well, Alasdair, we've got more questions than we're going to be able to get to today, but you've certainly, I think, focused people's attention quite importantly on this theater and realizing that there are great things at stake here, much more than just what people are going to get told about when they see on the evening news the map of Ukraine and the little war room discussions. They're not talking about how this is going to undermine vital aspects of everyone's financial lives, the Eurozone, and then how the knock-on effect of that would be on everyone else's lives. Could you talk to us about that? Because there was a question here. Hans P. says, where do you see the euro in 5 years' time, and what's the alternative for Europeans? Well, 5 years is a long time with the way things are moving right now, but what happens should these exogenous stresses just put a lot of crimp on European banks? How do you see that playing out?
I think I've answered the 5-year story. I don't think it'll exist. I think the euro is toast, and the banks are toast with it. How they'll survive, I honestly don't know. I think that an awful lot of them will go bust. I think that we're looking at Herstatt replay. Herstatt was a German bank. It was a sort of small to medium-sized private bank, a German bank, which dealt a lot in foreign exchange markets. And that blew up in 1974. And the whole of the financial system nearly fell over. I mean, not just Europe, but also America. And that was one bank. I'm not talking about a situation where there's going to be a whole swathe of banks within the Eurozone falling over. And the Eurozone, the Euro system, which is the ECB and all the national central banks, in negative equity. I mean, how's that going to work out? I think it's going to be a real disaster. I don't know what's going to replace it. I mean, this is why I said earlier on that I hope that someone like Jens Wiedemann, is around to oversee the reintroduction of the Deutschmark. I think that's going to be necessary. And I think that if that can be managed properly, and it will probably have to be backed by gold, I mean, credibly backed by gold, on that basis, I think that there is a future for Europe. But it's going to mean the end of, the sort of not just the Eurozone, but I think the end of Brussels as well. And that's a good thing, because Brussels is just, it's a socialist bureaucracy on top of European socialist bureaucracies. I mean, the poor, the poor economies in Europe, I mean, they're operating way under their potential, simply because of government interventions. And they've got it on both levels, Brussels and local. I mean, this is, I think the American comparison is probably be like living in California squared, where you've got local taxes, local maladministration, and all the interventions and all the rest of it, on top of which you got the Fed. So, that's the only comparison I would make between the Eurozone and America. The idea that it's the United States of Europe forget it. It doesn't work. But certainly, if you're trying to run a business in California, you are disadvantaged compared with running it somewhere else, which is why I understand quite a lot of businesses are moving out of California and trying to go to places like Texas.
Well, Alasdair, you always give us lots to think about when we visit with you, and I know that it's not realistic to ask people to pin things down to timelines, but certainly the events and the interplay and the interdependencies that you've described are very concerning and ones that we need to be aware of. People need to take appropriate action. If people want to follow your regular writings and your work, where should they go?
Go to goldmoney.com. I publish an article every Thursday afternoon EST time, and I do a market report on the Friday. So goldmoney.com /research/insights or the market report bit, and consider using our facilities for us to store some gold and silver for you. Open an account. I think it might be a sensible thing, if you don't have any gold or silver, to think in terms of maybe stashing something away for that rainy day, which I hope doesn't happen. But unfortunately, as time goes on, I think it's becoming more and more likely. And it's got to the point where I think it's getting almost impossible to see how it can be avoided.
Well, Alasdair, thank you again for joining us here on Liberty and Finance. On behalf of all of our viewers, we appreciate your presence with us.
That's my pleasure, DK.
Miles Franklin Precious Metals is one of America's oldest and most trusted bullion dealers. Miles Franklin is A+ rated and accredited by the Better Business Bureau, licensed and bonded, and has 0 complaints ever registered. Here at Liberty and Finance, we are licensed brokers with Miles Franklin. To order, simply call us, discuss your needs, and we will let you know our live inventory, prices, and availability, and lock in your order over the phone. Once your order is locked, the price is held for you regardless of market fluctuations, and the metals are reserved for you awaiting your settled payment. Within 1 business day of ordering, you will receive an email invoice detailing the order and payment instructions. Miles Franklin accepts payments by bank wire, ACH or electronic check, money order, check mailed priority mail, and cryptocurrency. The fastest forms of payment are bank wire and cryptocurrency. Upon settled payment, metals will ship out within 3 to 5 business days. You will receive tracking information via email. Domestic shipping charges are $15 for any order under 500 ounces of silver or 10 ounces of gold. For orders larger than that, domestic shipping is free. The package will be double boxed, fully insured, and labeled discreetly, with no indication of the contents inside. For your privacy, the name Miles Franklin will not even be on the package. To talk to myself, Elijah, my brother Kaiser, or my father Dunnigan, call 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237.